Hello Raptors fans and welcome back to Raptors Report. Today we're going to be looking at the Toronto Raptors season, which begins imminently. And we're going to be breaking down all of the things that you have to look out for this year, how I think that they're going to do, what other people think, all of that good stuff. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump right into the first section, which is what are other people saying about the Toronto Raptors? And now, I know it's not always the best to get your information from NBA generalists because a lot of the time they simply look at what's on the paper and what the record was for the team last season and maybe don't get as far in depth as maybe beat writers and media from Toronto or people on social media who follow and cover the team. But one thing to keep in mind is that these people are less biased about the state of the team than your average Toronto sports fan. And it is always interesting to get a look at what other sources have to say about the Toronto Raptors, because sometimes you can get a little lost in the sauce. You can really drink the Homer juice and get a little too hyped about the team. Maybe you saw something in preseason, or you liked a roster addition, or you think that all of the young players are going to get better and everything is going to turn up roses for the Toronto Raptors. But that, as we all know, those of us who've been watching for, decades, that's not the case with really any sports team. Everybody tends to view their own backyard is a little bit more special than everybody else's, so it's important to take what other people are saying and maybe keep it in mind, keep yourself grounded. And let me tell you, what people are saying about the Toronto Raptors is not that pretty. Vegas has the Toronto Raptors over-under set to 29.5 games, depending on where you look and when the article was written, but around that range, 29.5 to 30.5. And that's kind of in the ballpark of what other media sources are saying the Raptors are going to be at. So not quite at the bottom of the Eastern Conference, but still outside of the playoffs. And Bill Simmons and Ryan Russillo did a Ringer podcast where they looked at all of the different teams and picked the over or the under. And when they picked up the line at 29.5, they saw that that was the line for Vegas at that point. All three of them, House was on the program as well. They all slammed the under. They locked the under. So they were completely not confident in the Toronto Raptors making it above 30 wins. I don't know. I think Bill has it out for the Toronto Raptors for a long time. They're a division rival of the Boston Celtics, and he's obviously a Boston homer. But the other two are relatively unbiased, and they both don't like the Toronto Raptors to make that over. NBA.com had the Toronto Raptors coming in at number 22 in the league, so the 9th worst record in the league. Sports Illustrated had the Toronto Raptors at 21, so the 10th worst team in the league, and those are all kind of in the ballpark of where you will see the Toronto Raptors ranked by the outside media, the national media, the United States media. And I would say that that's relatively fair. The Toronto Raptors are not looking to be contenders this season. They're on the outside looking in. And I'm going to get to what I think about the Toronto Raptors as a unit and what you can expect from them this season, in my opinion. But that's the outside perspective on the Toronto Raptors. Moving on, we have to talk about the schedule because there's a couple of interesting things happening there, especially the opening early schedule. The first 4 games are pretty scary looking on paper. They start off with the Cleveland Cavaliers at home on Wednesday, and then the Sixers, Timberwolves, and Nuggets are all on the menu for the Toronto Raptors after that. And it looks kind of like a murderer's row of opening games. Now, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. The Cavaliers are missing notorious Raptors killer Max Strus. He has an injury and he's going to be out a couple of months. The Sixers are also banged up. Paul George and Joel Embiid are questionable to play versus the Raptors, so who knows there. But the Wolves and the Nuggets are obviously two of the best teams in the Western Conference, so very difficult opening stretch. And if you look beyond that at just the schedule in general, the first 25 games, 22 of those games are against teams that had a 500 record or better last season. So it is a very difficult stretch of games to start the season. So what that means is that the Toronto Raptors will probably have a losing record to start the season, and it could get pretty ugly. Unless they kind of play out of their minds and beat a bunch of very good teams, they might start the season with only a couple of wins in the first 10 games. The back half of the schedule, on the other hand, is a complete cakewalk, with multiple games against the Jazz, the Wizards, the Blazers, the Bulls, the Hornets, and various other bottom feeders. It is just a buffet of cakewalk matchups. And so what I'm thinking might happen is that there might be a bit of whiplash in the fan base, because if you've been paying attention, this coming season is kind of a race for Cooper Flag, and there's obviously other very interesting prospects in the NBA draft coming up this year, including Ace Bailey, among other names. It's apparently a very good draft class. So there will be people who are cheering for the tank, which I understand. And at the beginning of the season, if the Raptors come out slow and really fall behind, that contingent of the fan base will probably get very loud and be cheering for tanking. But towards the end of the season, the Toronto Raptors will be facing a bunch of really easy teams, really probably bad teams who might be fully committed to the tank, and then their record might get a little bit better and they might fall out of that tank race. And I really don't like to be a conspiracy theorist because, you know, I cover the sport and I love the NBA, but they showed a graphic on the broadcast for the Raptors, and they showed all of the teams with the most difficult schedules, and the Raptors were right at the top, and the rest of the teams on that list, to a T, were all teams that figured to be in the bottom of the league. And it really seems like the NBA is kind of creating the haves and have-nots kind of right out of the gate, creating a separation between the good teams and the bad teams. The good teams will be playing against the bad teams will be playing against the good teams, and so the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer, so to speak. And then toward the end of the season, that's when the bad teams will be playing the bad teams and the good teams will be playing the good teams. I can only assume that the idea there is that towards the playoffs, the good teams will be playing against one another more, creating more buzz and more intrigue. Good teams playing against good teams, it's always a draw for fans and creates a lot of hype for networks, especially building up to the playoffs. So that's my theory. But yeah, the Raptors schedule is very hard to start and easy to end. So who knows what happens, but it seems like the Raptors will have a very difficult time out of the gate. Next up, let's talk about the Raptors roster, and we'll start with the good news. We'll start with what I see from the roster and why I think that the Toronto Raptors have a chance in the Eastern Conference, what I like about the team, the advantages that they have. And starting right off, you got to talk about the core of RJ, Scotty Barnes, and Emmanuel Quickley. Those are the three young players who are just beginning their primes and are on the up and up that should help the Toronto Raptors drive wins. Scotty Barnes will be entering his 4th season, Emmanuel Quickley will be entering his 5th season, and RJ Barrett will be entering his 6th season. If you can believe it, he's still only 24 years old, so it's a little surprising to see that that's how many years he has in the league. All of the things that you associate with young players, where they're still learning the game, still learning how to win, those are kind of not as big problems with those three anymore, and they should contribute to winning minutes. Outside of those three, Jakob Poeltl is probably the guy that will drive the most winning this season, and essentially he is a very good role player at center. He's a stabilizing force. He knows how to play the game. If you've been watching any of my post-game recap videos, you know that he's very consistent night to night. You know what you're going to get from him. He's not going to do anything too exciting, but really that's not his job. His job is to provide defense, rebounding, rim finishing, screen setting, making reads out of the high post, that kind of thing. Not exciting, but getting the job done. Next up, the offensive system is starting to look a bit more polished. Guys are settling into their roles, and it looks like they are much better drilled at what Darko Rajakovic wants out of them on the offensive side of the ball. Ball movement is a big priority. Player movement is another big priority. Cuts, flares, lots of screens both on and off the ball, and good role definition. I think that players know what they should be doing while they're on the offensive side of the ball. They look like a cohesive unit which is more than can be said for last season, especially with all of the injuries, people in and out of the lineup, and also with guys not having a full training camp, especially after all the big trades were made. There was a learning curve, and that is no longer as much of a problem. So with that continuity, there is more avenues for success. I think that the Toronto Raptors have a good offensive system, and once it's in place and players can get comfortable there, the Raptors will be able to generate buckets, especially in the half court, which has been a problem for them over the past 5 years or so. They have not had very good half court ratings. I expect an uptick there. As for the bench and veterans, the Toronto Raptors do have some interesting veterans. Chris Boucher, Bruce Brown, Kelly Olynyk, to name a few. All three of those players, unfortunately, right now have question marks around their health. Chris Boucher injured himself in the preseason, went knee to knee, and his status is kind of up in the air. Kelly Olynyk did not play any preseason games, hopefully just as a precautionary measure. They mentioned that his back might have been acting up. He was active for the Canadian national team over the summer, so he might need some R&R time just to get his back right. And Bruce Brown, obviously he had knee surgery right before training camp, but I believe that all three of those, as long as they're still on the roster, should be able to play at least significant minutes, perhaps maybe not in October, maybe at the beginning or middle of November, that kind of thing. But once they do play, I think that those players will put a floor on how bad the Toronto Raptors can be off of the bench. They are wily veterans who know how to play the game, and while they're not stars by any stretch of the imagination, I think that once they're healthy, they should provide some decent minutes for the Toronto Raptors. Next up is the tandem of Grady Dick and Ochai Agbaji, who I am going to sort of slot together because those are the two players that I am the most interested in tracking their development. Because for those two, unlike Scotty Barnes, RJ Barrett, and Emmanuel Quickley, who I all think are going to be good, I don't know exactly how much I can expect from Ochai Agbaji or Grady Dick. And Grady Dick did have a very good end to the previous season when he kind of came on and started shooting a lot better. And in preseason, he has had very high highs. He's looked great, but he's also had inconsistencies with his jump shot. Ochai Agbaji has really piqued my interest this preseason by playing very solid, smart basketball, but he was also very disappointing at the end of last season when the Toronto Raptors acquired him. So I'm not exactly sure what I can expect from those two, but I am pretty optimistic. Hopefully both of them can be positive contributors for the Raptors this season. Lastly, we'll talk about the point guard position off of the bench, because I think that the Toronto Raptors have the potential to have finally a competent backup point guard situation. And last season, when Dennis Schroeder was in the starting lineup and Malachi Flynn was coming off of the bench, it was probably the worst point guard rotation in the league, but when Emmanuel Quickley came in and Schroeder was moved to the bench, it looked a lot better. Since Schroeder has left, the Toronto Raptors had to solidify that spot, and I think that they have the potential to have a decent backup point guard situation because they have two players that look interesting. Davion Mitchell was picked up this offseason in the Jalen McDaniels trade, and he has had his ups and downs as a player. He has mostly disappointed based on his draft spot, which was 9th overall in the 2021 draft, but there are some interesting things that he brings to the table. Jamal Shed is another player that really impressed in the preseason, and he looked like a guy who could come in and contribute this season, and in my opinion, he's even impressed more than Davion Mitchell. But he is a rookie, and it's important not to get too high based on preseason minutes. Although between the two of them, I am slightly more confident in the backup point guard situation, which has been a Raptors Achilles heel ever since Kyle Lowry left and Fred VanVleet was promoted off of the bench. They've had a big void back there, and perhaps it might not be so dire this season. And with the positives out of the way, there's probably some other positives that I haven't really addressed here, and I could go further into depth about why Scotty Barnes and RJ and Emmanuel Quickley are so special. But in the interest of keeping things brief, I will list them as positives and perhaps go into further depth in other videos about what the special things they bring to the table are. But we have to get to the Raptors roster negatives, the downsides, the frowny face stuff. And the first thing, the big glaring hole that I see on this roster is among the top perimeter players that the Raptors have on the roster, there is not enough defense. So 3 of the top players on the Raptors who will be seeing minutes at the guard spot are Immanuel Quickley, RJ Barrett, and Grady Dick. And among those 3, I am not very confident that there is a good defender. I think that adequate is something that perhaps a few of them could aim for. They would have to improve their games in order to be competent defenders. And a lot has been made over the summer and at Media Day talking about those players becoming players who are known for their defense. I have to warn you though, this is something that almost every player in the NBA who is not known for a certain skill says about themselves. They will say, I am really aiming to do X skill, the skill that they don't have in their repertoire. I want to be more of this. I mean, Grady Dick hasn't come out and said it, but Immanuel Quickley and RJ Barrett certainly have. RJ Barrett said that he wants to be a lockdown defender. Immanuel Quickley says that he wants to be known for his defense. And of course, Grady Dick was a rookie last season and his defense was quite poor, but he's obviously trying to get better in that respect as well. But among those 3, there might be some problems on the defensive end. Of course, when you start looking a little further back, so Ochai Agbaji, Jamal Shed, Davion Mitchell, those 3 are good defenders. The unfortunate thing is that they are kind of the opposite side of the coin. They are very good defenders, but perhaps leave something wanting on the offensive side of the ball. So it'll be up to Darko to find ways of mixing those minutes so that the Raptors are not too slanted in one direction, getting picked apart on the defensive end. But that's an issue that I see with the roster as it stands right now. The next thing is that the Toronto Raptors starters, Immanuel Quickley, RJ Barrett, Scotty Barnes, and Jakob Poeltl, I think that should be a pretty strong group of 4. But when you put it up against the top teams in the league, it doesn't quite measure up. It is stronger than the bottom dwellers, that is for sure, and on some nights when they all have it going and everyone is on a string and looking good, I think it's possible for those players to look better than some other teams' cores. But the unfortunate thing is that the Toronto Raptors, as they're getting better, they are still climbing the mountain. They are not near the summit. When you have a team with a lot of young players, players who have promise, players who the front office see as future contributors, the issue with that is that they have not yet arrived. You cannot, with 100% certainty, know what they bring to the table. And while I think RJ Barrett, Immanuel Quickley, and Scotty Barnes are going to be good players this season, I don't know how good they're going to be. They could be very good, they could be excellent, or they could regress slightly. When it comes to the much younger players, the players like Grady Dick, Jacoby Walter, Jamal Shed, Ochai Agbaji, the Toronto Raptors are kind of counting on those guys to get better. If they want to be a good team this season, or at least an average team, most of the young players are going to have to take a step forward. They can't quite afford a down season from too many of them. And when it comes to young players, that happens more often. A lot of players don't measure up. A lot of players, perhaps you thought that they had star potential, and in your mind, that's where you're pegging them. You're saying this player is going to become a star. And if that doesn't transpire, a lot of the time they become serviceable role players and rotation players, but they don't quite live up to the promise that you had for them. And that happens with young rosters. So I expect just the law of averages. It's probably going to happen to at least one of the young players this season. And if the Raptors have too many of those things happen, they are going to be much worse than you expect. Moving along, my predictions for this season on the whole. Now, with the Raptors and with a lot of young teams, especially teams that are not out and out tanking, I believe that it's very difficult to peg where the Raptors will stand at the end of the season from a record perspective. If it's a repeat of last season where there's a ton of injuries and guys are out for long periods of time and they're missing key rotation players, they could be absolutely terrible. They don't have the talent level or the breadth of talent to withstand too many injuries like some of the other top teams in the East do. There isn't a pure floor on the team like some of the others. So I think that could be a big downside for them, especially if they fall behind early and perhaps make some trades. They could even deal some veteran players that are on their roster right now if they feel like they should be rebuilding. And that's always a possibility. You never know. Then they could easily have a win total in the low 20s. If they don't have significant injuries and they withstand the opening storm of the schedule, they have enough talent to separate themselves from the true dregs of the East. And that's where you could start to see the Toronto Raptors creep up into the mid to high 30s even. If everything goes right for them, a bunch of young players take a step forward, they could impress and start clawing their way up the standings. So there's a very large range there. Vegas predicted 29.5 or 30.5. I'm going to go a little higher than that. As you could probably expect, I'm a glass half full kind of guy. I predict that the Toronto Raptors will finish the season with 33 wins, 49 losses, and finish 10th in the Eastern Conference. And I know that for some people, that might be very low. You might be looking at me, calling me crazy, saying, "Where's your fan spirit? Why aren't you boosting them up? Aren't you a Raptors fan?" I am a Raptors fan, and I love the team very much. I'm expecting the Toronto Raptors to be more fun to watch this season. I think that there's a lot of very interesting storylines, guys to cheer for, rookies to watch out for. I think it should be a fun season to watch, but I have my doubts about how competitive the team is going to be. If everything goes right, players take a step forward, they do start winning games if they start the season hot, you will not find a person who's happier than I am. But as long as they are putting in the effort and I see growth from the younger players, I will be satisfied with the Toronto Raptors record come what may. In any case, that is my breakdown for the Toronto Raptors 2024-25 season. I hope you enjoyed listening and could take something away from it. And if you have any comments, please let me know here in the comments section and also on Twitter, where you can reach me at Raps Report. I'm always very interested in hearing what other Raptors fans have to say about the team. Am I a homer? Am I not giving the team enough credit? Let me know. Always love to hear it. And as always, thank you for tuning in to Raptors Report, your source for in-depth Raptors content.